Welcome, everyone. We're going to begin. I see Linda has just come on, and that's great. And maybe there will be some others who join us. Jeff Chalmers, who is a chaplain in the Hamilton jail, was to be with us tonight, but he called me yesterday indicating that some things in his life had really needed his attention. And so he's going to take David's spot later on. And thankfully, David was willing to move his presentation a few weeks forward. So that's why David is here with us rather than Jeff. And I think Jennifer sent something out to that effect, did she not?
Yeah,
Yes.
she did.
Okay.
Yeah.
She did.
Okay. So those of you who don't know, David was my minister when I was living in Kapuskasing. That's during the period where I left the United Church and at the invitation of some friends, started attending the Presbyterian Church and finding out what that was all about. And it was under David's encouragement that I ended up leaving my work there and going to Knox College. After, I think it was after second year maybe, I went out to Saskatoon where David and his wife Audrey were living with their two boys, Joel and Jonathan, and I lived with them there for a summer and worked with David in the church in Saskatoon. And again, that was crucial to my learning and my faith formation. And so we go back a long way, and I'm very, very thankful for our long and enduring friendship. Like Mark, David has a great sense of humor. And so we have a lot of fun together, but also like Mark, they both bring, some wonderful depth and experience and education to the moment. So David is now semi-retired, but still teaching courses at Tyndale. Is it Tyndale University or Tyndale Theological School, David?
Well, the whole school is known as Tyndale University, but I teach in the graduate program. I chair two programs there.
Okay.
So
and then David, sorry, go ahead.
Actually, I just stepped down from the church. I've been teaching full time for 30 years there. So I'm still full time.
You've been teaching at Tyndale for 30 years?
Actually, 33.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And during much of that time, you were in full-time ministry at Cornerstone?
I was the lead minister at Cornerstone Church for that time. Yeah.
And that, where is that located again? Kleinburg, right.
North part
and then
of Toronto.
David, sorry?
It's just the north of Toronto in the city of Vaughan.
And then David fills in for his son Joel in Paris part-time, and then his other son Jonathan is a doctor and works, I think, primarily out of McMaster University, where is he the chair of education or something?
He's the vice dean of education and medical education and research, and the head of trauma at the Hamilton General.
At the Hamilton General.
Yeah. And St. Joe's.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful to have your boys and your grandchildren close to you, and wonderful for us to have you with us tonight, David. So without further ado, I turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Sean. Well, I could tell you all lots of great stories of our times together in Saskatoon. And the church was not totally wrecked after Sean left, but we survived. It's always been great to have this friendship and connection. And when Joel went to Trinity Church to work as an intern under Sean, he said to me, "Do you have any advice to give me?" And I said, "Well, there's just one piece of advice. Get even." And I don't know what happened, but I'll leave it at that. Since I've been a minister for a long time and been teaching in the seminary for all these years, so I get to see people from all kinds of walks of life. And one of the things about ministry, what didn't take long to learn is you have to help people who go through grief and loss in their life, whether it's through death or it's something else. And I began to do some programs on grief recovery. And as I was doing that, I began to understand that many people needed help. And so at Tyndale, we've developed the very first master's degree in what is called thanatology. So I gave that word to Sean, and I wasn't thinking it was going to be used in this section, but the word thanatology just means the study of grief, bereavement, death, and dying. And so I thought tonight I would just focus a bit about how we grieve and how do we grieve our losses, because many people are experiencing a lot of losses today with the reality of what's going on in life. So we're going to look at the first slide, which says, well, what actually is grief?
Can I just interrupt? What are people seeing? Are they seeing one slide, or are they seeing multiple slides on their screen?
One slide. One slide.
Just one slide.
Just the title, Grieving Our Losses?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So we're going to go to the next slide.
Yeah, give me a second here. I've got
So a lot of people wonder, so what in the world is grief? And I would say, to put it very simply, grief is our reaction to a loss in our life. And there are lots of inner feelings that people have around losses. But how do we begin to express our loss? And that is what we call mourning. And so people in different ways mourn in different cultures. And from different cultures mourn in different ways. I remember the first time I heard someone starting to wail, and I practically jumped out of my skin because I had never heard that before. And yet we are often not very good at expressing our grief, and it begins to show itself in a lot of different ways. So for some people, there can be feelings of anger, there can be feelings of helplessness, there can be feelings of relief and guilt, there can be anxiety. So there can be a lot of different ways that grief will begin to manifest itself in people's lives. And there can be a lot of different physical sensations. For example, you might have a tightness in your chest. You could find that you lack energy and you don't know what you're going to do. For some, there can be social ways that grief will manifest itself, like I don't want to be around people, or it's very difficult. One of the elders in my church, their 21-year-old son drowned in a tragic accident 3 years ago. And his wife to this day finds it very difficult to be in church because there's so many memories of her son sitting there with her. And this is a long process of dealing with grief. So I just put it this way. Grief is really, really messy. And there's no one way that people begin to express their grief. So if grief is our reaction to loss, what are the types of loss that we look at? So this next slide will give us just a few. Well, for many, one of the most prominent would be the loss of a loved one or a friend or whoever it might be through death. And in a sense, this potentially could be one of the most severe types of loss that people experience. Another one could be a divorce. It's the loss of a relationship, or some people refer to it as the death of a marriage. And so we know that many people going through a divorce have all kinds of feelings of grief in terms of what has transpired. Not just the two people in the marriage, but if there are children, they will experience a lot of grief and sadness as well, maybe even anger or frustration or whatever it's going to be, because they have lost that which they have known. And then there can be the loss, for example, of external objects. And for some people, it could be, I have lost my job. And we know that with COVID, many jobs have been cut and people are struggling with that. Some people might have had a house fire and they have lost some of their prized possessions. Very often they speak about photo albums or special things that were given to them by other individuals. So even natural disasters can bring about significant loss in people's life, and they grieve their losses. Or it could be something like an inanimate object. For example, if you lose your spouse, you have, in a sense, lost a social role that you once knew. You were a couple, now you are single. If you lose your job, you have lost maybe a position that you held in an organization. I heard of one man who was laid off. He worked in downtown Toronto on Bay Street. Every day, following the loss, he put on his three-piece suit and tie, went to the subway, went downtown, spent the day downtown, and then came home at night. And only after 6 months of that did he ever tell his wife that he had lost his job. So that was a significant type of loss that he had experienced. So when we have all these losses, the question is this: how do we process our grief? And so we want to look at just 3 simple little steps. There are many more factors that can go into this grieving process. But in the light of trying to keep this within the time frame and then opening it up for questions or comments or discussions, I just want to look at these 3. So the first one is a psychological term. And I just threw that in because I thought it was really fancy. And I didn't know what this word meant for a long time, but I figured it out. The word is decathexis. So let me put it this way. Suppose you have started a friendship with somebody, and over a period of time, your friendship has grown and grown. And what you discover is that you have an emotional bonding with that person. That is called a cathexis. So cathexis is just an emotional bonding. So I think about it, as Sean mentioned, I have 2 sons and I have 6 grandkids. My youngest granddaughter just turned 6. So over the past 6 years, I have gotten to know her. From the very day that she was born, I held her in the hospital. And last weekend, we celebrated her birthday. So I've had 6 years of emotionally bonding with that little one. Now, if that child or if that person you have bonded with dies, or even if they had moved away, there has to be a process of letting go, because the relationship cannot be the same as it once was. Doesn't mean you forget about them. So if someone you love has died, some people say, well, let's just not think about them. That's crazy talk. You're thinking about them a lot. But what I do in the grieving process is I start to let go of the emotional bonds, because the relationship cannot be the same as it once was. And so it's going to be a different type of relationship, because it will be based on past memories that I have, since it is not going forward in this process of time. And so that's the first one. It's the loosening of the ties that one had with the person or the lost object, if you are grieving over something you have lost. But the second thing is this: if I have lost a loved one or a friend to death, I need to now develop a new relationship with that person. And that relationship is largely based upon recollection, memory, and all of our past experiences.
Yeah.
So the person has to be remembered as someone who lived, but who has died. And to do that, to develop a new relationship with the deceased, I have to have a realistic image of who that person was. And sometimes I have to reconcile some of the different aspects of their personality. I'm sure you've been to funerals where there's been eulogies and the person is just, been expressed to the highest heavens as the most wonderful person on the earth. And you know that they actually have a few flaws. And so how do you reconcile that as you try to move forward? And so people have lived with some of these little statements that I don't know how we started with them, but one of them is never speak ill of the dead. Well, if someone you loved also had a miserable side, one has to be able to deal with that and to bring some reconciliation if I'm going to move forward in that relationship. And then the third step is I need to form a new identity. There's an awareness that the loss has changed who I am as a person. And this loss might need to be augmented by maybe new behaviors or new skills or even new relationships. So for example, if my wife died, I would have to begin to look at what are some of the new roles that I will have to take on? What are some of the skills that I might need to develop? Or what new relationships would be there? Would I spend more time with my children? Would I spend time with my friends? Or would I meet new people who could be part of my life? And so that's a very broad perspective of what the process of grief needs to do. But let me tell you this, there is no time frame for this. Some people say, well, you should be over by now. Well, why should they be over? We are processing grief. And remember this, grief is very messy. So why is it so difficult? So I want to take a look at, just very briefly, that grief is part of what we call separation anxiety. Now, there is a writer, his name is David Schweitzer, and he looks at grief as almost like an anxiety attack. I've never had an anxiety attack, but I know what it's like to feel anxious. But we talk a lot about separation anxiety. And so the first thing he says is this: many people have the fear of abandonment. Take, for example, suppose you had a 2-year-old child. They're learning their own self-identity. And let's say you go to a mall and you're the parent or the grandparent of a 2-year-old, and they want to run away from you. Now, it's interesting, as they're running away, do you ever notice that they stop and look to make sure you are still there? And if you should hide behind a pillar, they're going to have a meltdown because they can't find mom or dad or whoever that person was in their life. And so this, in many ways, many people who are grieving, it's going back to this essential fear that many of us had from childhood of being abandoned. What's going to happen to me? And so don't be surprised that as people are grieving and working through their losses, there could be this feeling of abandonment. And that's why they need the security of people who are going to be there in their life. And so it's very painful if you have to grieve alone. And so if grief is a form of separation anxiety, then you ought to expect people to be anxious. For example, the old Westerns that we're showing, a guy gets shot and his buddy would come and say, just hang on there, Jude, or whatever your name happens to be. Hang on, don't let go. And we're going to get you to the doctor and you're going to be okay. And people are hanging on. So if fear is a form of separation anxiety, we should expect people to be anxious. And the more anxious they are, the tighter will be their grip to hold on. And that's why the presence of other people who are a source of security is a tremendous antidote to some of their feelings of anxiety. And sometimes just being able to talk it out is a way to slowly mitigate their anxiety. I'm sure Sean can affirm this, but I know that many times when I'm working with people who've lost a loved one, whether they're members of my congregation or whoever it happened to be, sometimes they tell this story over and over and over again, to the point that I probably know the story as well as they do. But part of it is that they know that they can begin to express it, their feelings, their anxiety. And so they're in a safe place where that can actually happen. And then realize this, that grief is an expression of our love. You know, in the Bible, we are told by Jesus that we are to love one another. Let me say this. When we encourage people to love each other, we are ultimately asking people to grieve, because the people you love will someday be gone. And that's why we feel sad. You know, imagine a little child is going to school with his or her little friend, and they hang out around a lot. And then the little friend tells them, my mom and dad are moving to a new town and we're going to have to go away. And they feel really sad, because grief is an expression of their love. And so I would say this in ministry, that if we are going to teach people to grieve, then we need to teach people how to, if we're going to teach people how to love, rather, then we need to teach people how to grieve, and how to grieve really well. So one of the things I was thinking about is, so how do we grieve? And in the Bible, there are these many famous prayers called lament. Now, people say, I don't know how to lament. So let me ask you this. Do you know how to complain? I'm sure none of you have ever complained in your life. But if you know how to complain, you know how to grieve. You've got the very first step. Now, in the Bible, especially in the book of Psalms, there's 150 of them. Roughly 50% of the Psalms are praise unto God, and about 50% are lament. And they're kind of all mixed in different places. And I think part of the reason is this. That's kind of what life is like. There are days when things are going well, and days when we are in the pit of despair. Now, in the Bible, now I'm not a Hebrew expert, but here is a wonderful Hebrew word, and it's in English letters. The word is hesed. And that was a key word for the people in the Old Testament. And the word can be translated different ways, but one of the translations is loving kindness. So for example, Psalm 136 says, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. His hesed endures forever. Now that psalm has that phrase, I don't know how many times, but numerous times in that one little psalm. And so people believe in God's loving kindness towards them. But then when they have struggles, when they have difficulties, when life is not going the way they expected it, when they experience losses in their life, they begin to ask two questions. And the first question is, why is this happening to me? And sometimes they'll ask, well, why is it happening now? A friend of mine was a high school principal, and when he turned 65 and was going to step into retirement, he was diagnosed with cancer. Now he's gone through treatments and he is still doing okay, but this is now probably 10 years later. But when he was diagnosed, his family said, why is this happening now? And why is this happening to him? And then sometimes when we're in difficult situations, we want to know, so how long is this going to last? And if I know that there's an end in sight, then maybe I can endure it. But we don't know. The why question, I think, for many of us in North America is almost an entitlement question. Like, we have everything going for us. We're a first world. We have healthcare, we have education, we have clean drinking water, we have plenty of food to eat, etc. And so when things begin to upset our plans, we begin to ask this question, why? Why? Now, many people around the world ask that question. And so one of the things we don't say to people is, well, that's just the way life is. You got to kind of suck it up. Or some people get really mad at God and say, what am I going, why should I believe in God? I thought he was good. Why is he allowing this to happen to me at this time? There is a place for lament. And so I want to talk about two things, why it is important. The importance of lament is a statement that I learned from a songwriter whose name is Michael Card. Michael Card is also somewhat of a theologian. He lives in the southern US, and you can Google him online. You can hear his music, and he has written a couple of books on lament. But there are two statements that I thought were important. And the first one is this: failure to lament cuts us off from each other. The Bible says, we celebrate with those who are rejoicing, and we weep with those who are sad. And so if I'm always putting on a happy face, and a lot of people will ask you this question, how are you doing? We say, fine. Where on the inside, we could be in a very bad place. If we can't be honest and lament with each other, how do we ever build authentic relationships so we can walk with each other on this journey? But the second part is this: the failure to lament cuts us off from God. I mean, God knows what's going on in our lives. But if we can't be authentic with him about this pain as well as the joy in life, how can we ever develop any sense of intimacy with God? And so one of the things that I have found very helpful with people who have lost a loved one and are struggling is to teach them how to lament. And so the last part of tonight, which will only be about 5 minutes, and then we can go into questions, is this: I would like to teach you how to lament. And then you can use this in any situation you want in your own life. And it comes from the Psalms. So this is a biblical approach to lament. And the pattern is found in Psalm 13. Now you're going to see that there will be 3 steps. It's just 3 simple steps. The first thing we have to do is to bring the lament to God. In other words, I need to be honest and I need to be open with him. So here's what the psalmist said: how long, O Lord? Remember that question? How long? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? So that's the question. God, where are you in the midst of my life? How long, again, must I wrestle with my thoughts and every day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? So that's the first thing we need to do. We need to be open and we need to be transparent before God. And this writer said, God, have you forgotten me? I don't see you anywhere. Where is God? I don't sense your presence. How long will you hide your face from me? So that's the first step. We bring our lament to God. The second step is this: I cry for help. So the psalmist goes on and says, look to me and answer me, O God. Give light to my eyes or I will sleep in death. And my enemies will say, I have overcome this one, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. So it's almost like he's grabbing God by the lapels and saying, look to me, answer me, God. This is what I want to know. How long is this going on? And then he has this request, give light to my eyes. In other words, give me some sense of direction, or I might as well be dead. Can you kind of get that emotional feeling? And then there is a third step. And this always happens in a lament. And the third step is an expression of trust. Sometimes this trust is very small. It's just like a little bit of light cracking through the door into the darkness. Of all the Psalms in the Bible of lament, only Psalm 88 does not have the expression of trust. That's the only one. It's kind of left in the darkness. So what does the psalmist say? I will rejoice in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. So remember this part? I'm not rejoicing in my situation or my circumstances. I will rejoice in your unfailing love. That's that word hesed that we talked about earlier. My heart rejoices in your salvation. And I will sing. It's an act of trust to the Lord, for he has been good to me. So that's why you sometimes need to go back and recall your life with God and some of the good things, because often in grief, we are so focused that that's all we see and think about. There are many, many examples of lament in the Bible, many stories. We could read the book of Job. He lost everything, even his health. He lost his children. He lost his home. He lost his servants. He lost his economy. His wife even didn't want to hang around him. But we can look at Jeremiah. For 40 years, he proclaimed God's word as a prophet. And the people threw him in the stocks. Then they threw him in a dry well, and they rejected him. And after 40 years, it is doubtful that he even had a single convert after all those years of ministry. We could think of Joseph, who was sold by his brothers as a slave. Potiphar's wife falsely accuses him. He loses his freedom, thrown into a prison. And all those terrible things happen to him. But he begins to see God working out a plan that he could not see in the moment of time, but eventually God revealed it in the bigger picture. And when his brothers came to him trembling because they thought Joseph was going to do them in with his power and authority, he says to them these words, what you meant was for harm, but God meant it for good. And he had worked through his grief. He was a changed person. But here's the last slide. Will I trust God? And this is the cry of Jesus. Remember on the cross, the cry of the forsaken. And this lament actually began in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus prays for a whole night. Father, if it's possible, let this cup be taken from me. He's working all through what it means to take upon himself the sin of humankind. And there he is on a cross, forsaken by God. But then the word of trust. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And that's what he did. And he died. And then we know the great story of the resurrection. And so as we go through grief, I'm not sure where you are in grief. There can be all kinds of losses. Some are struggling with losses right now. Some will be losses that have happened in your past. And sometimes grief is not easy to deal with. That's why we need a community of faith, that we can be there for each other. And I think as followers of Jesus, he has given us this wonderful family, which we call the church family, where we can share in each other's life and bring support and encouragement to one another. And then also realizing that God, by his Spirit, will enable us to grow through this journey.